I suggest that you create 4 different kinds of tools. And I know that that may sound like a lot, but there is a lot of overlap between them, and each has a different kind of function. So I'm going to first talk about the benefits of flashcards. I'll then turn to a high-level outline, also known by some as an attack sheet, and then what you might do in a more detailed outline, and then finally a outline or list of policy and theory issues that we address in class and that you might explore or elaborate a little bit further on as we are discussing these issues over the course of the semester. I'm going to take you through each one of these in a bit more detail. First, flashcards. As you know, there is a fair bit of memorization required in this class and in law school and on the bar exam. I strongly encourage you for that reason to begin now, if you haven't already, to identify rules that you need to memorize and to create flashcards that enable you to do that quickly and easily. Here you've got an example. On one side of the flashcard is firm offer. You might also add UCC section 2205. And on the other side, you've got the elements that are set out there. I've divided up the elements in a way that makes sense to me. You may divide them up a little differently. That what we've got to find is that there's an offer, and that offer needs to be by a merchant, and it needs to be to buy or sell goods. In addition, it needs to be in a signed writing. You could split that up into 2 elements if you wanted to, if that were easier for you. And that signed writing, on its face, by its terms, offers an assurance that it will be held open. If you've got all of that, then that signed writing will be irrevocable for the time stated on it, or if there's no time stated on it, for a reasonable time. And either way, that period should not exceed 3 months. And if this firm offer is on a form that the offeree has supplied, rather than something that the offeror has supplied, then it needs to be separately signed by the offeror. Anyway, I won't elaborate a lot on note cards other than to say that you should be sure to prepare them with respect to any of the rules that are listed on the syllabus. For example, the UCC provisions, the restatement provisions. They're a useful way of making sure that you've got the individual rules clearly in mind and the key elements. Last point here. Other than with respect to a couple of rules that we will be reciting over and over again in class, like Restatement Second, Section 24, or our definition of consideration, you can feel free to write the elements in a way that is easy to remember for you, rather than in the way that they are stated in the UCC or restatement provisions that I've asked you to learn. So long as they are substantively correct, I'm not a stickler for having exactly the language in the original provisions memorized. The next tool I urge you to create is a high-level outline or an attack sheet. The point of this is to provide you with an overarching view of the issues that you want to address. It should be very brief. What you have here is an extremely brief version. You can elaborate on it a little bit, as I'll show you in a moment, but I wouldn't go into too much detail because, again, the point here is to give you the bird's eye view. And you might even think about this as something that you can write down on a piece of paper in the first minute or two after you start an exam. Maybe not in all of this detail, but in basic form, so that you have that structure in mind. The structure should be super familiar to you by now. We start off always, we never forget that we begin by asking which body of law governs the transaction. Now note that on an exam, you're going to be specifying which transaction you're talking about, right? So particularly on the final exam, which may involve, in truth, which will likely involve analyzing multiple transactions, then you want to identify which one you're grappling with in this section of your essay. So you might say, which body of law governs the transaction between Omar and Lena? Next, the next question is, did X and Y form a contract? Form an enforceable contract. And that has two broad subparts. The first is whether X and Y formed a contract. And here we have our basic offer and acceptance analysis. And so we move through the steps. First is the communication and offer. Now note that on an exam, I don't want you to just say, was there an offer? Or vaguely, generally, is the communication an offer? Instead, you're going to go communication by communication until you find an offer. For example, you might say, is X's October 1st email to Y an offer? Now, if the answer to that is yes, you can move forward. But if the answer to that is no, then you are going to have to move to analyzing whether a subsequent communication is an offer. For example, is Y's October 2nd email to X an offer? Only once you've found an offer can you then move to the next step. What manner, medium, and means of acceptance did the offer or the offeror invite? Third, was the offer effectively terminated prior to acceptance? Fourth, was the offer accepted? Fifth, what are the terms of the agreement? Now, once we've concluded that X and Y have formed a contract, we've gone a long distance, but we don't yet know whether that contract is enforceable. And that is because the enforcement of contract could be barred by the statute of frauds. And so, in the next step here, we say, is the contract between X and Y enforceable? And we ask, is enforcement of the contract barred by the statute of frauds? And here we have our three steps under this. Is the contract within the statute, meaning is it the kind of contract that the statute of frauds is applicable to? If it is, we ask if the statute is satisfied. And if the statute is not satisfied, we ask whether the contract falls within an applicable exception to the statute. Whether you want to go into more detail on this front, I leave to you. But I'll give you an example of a little more detail on the next slide. So, if you want your high-level outline to be not quite at such a high level, to give you a bit more detail, you might elaborate a bit. Though, again, I caution you to be about elaborating so much that you lose sight of the structure. The high-level outline for the first half of the course should not exceed one side of one page. Again, it should be something that you can scribble down on your on a piece of scrap paper before you begin analyzing the facts on a prompt. So, for example, with respect to the section that says, was the offer effectively terminated prior to acceptance, you might elaborate a little bit by saying an offer may be terminated in the following ways and list them, and then note to yourself, if the offer was terminated prior to acceptance, what I need to then ask is whether another offer or counteroffer was made so that I can then go and figure out whether that one was accepted. Now let's talk about what a more detailed outline might look like. For a more detailed outline, what you want to do is once again start from the overarching structure that I've just been elaborating and that we have been working through over the course of this semester. But what you might do then is to take your notes and take the PowerPoint presentations that you've got and take the text and try to elaborate a little bit further so that you've got everything that you need to look at in one place. And I want to emphasize that once you've done this, you don't need to look at my PowerPoint presentations anymore. You don't need to look at the casebook anymore. You don't need to look at your notes anymore. The point here is to crystallize, to distill this so that this is the main thing that you are studying in the days leading up to the exam. Efficiency. So, what do you do here? I've tried to give you an example in relation to one of the steps in our analysis. And that is step B under was an enforceable contract formed, which is what manner, medium, and means of acceptance did the offeror invite. Now, what I suggest is that you begin each section by writing out the rule that covers that entire section. And this should be framed in a way that you could literally lift and put into the first part of your essay under that heading, right? So you know when you've got that heading, what manner, medium, and means of acceptance to the offer or invite, the first thing you're going to write is what follows. This is a great way of avoiding paralysis once you get into an exam. You know that you're going to have to cover this. You know where you're starting. You know what the rule is. And then once you've got this down, you might add any further refinements that the facts seem to require, some additional details to the rule that are pertinent only to this set of facts, or you might plunge into the facts themselves. Anyway, that's on an exam, but on your outline, you want to state your rule in a way that makes sense to you, that's concise, and that you feel you can really use on an exam. And then in the remaining sections of your detailed outline under this heading, you want to give yourself all of the detail that you need in order to tackle a question. So you might begin by defining relevant terms so that you're really sure you know what they mean. So manner here refers to whether the acceptance is going to be by return promise or instead by performance. And you might note, okay, an example of a return promise is that someone has to sign a contract in a designated space saying that they accept and return that to me. That's a great example of a return promise. An example of performance might be use the carbolic smoke ball as directed and contract the flue. Or it might be find my cat and bring it to me. Here you just want to have enough to jog your memory so that you know, oh yeah, that's what this means. That's what I mean by performance here. Similarly, medium and means refers to the medium of communication requested, for example, email or a song, and any other requirements that are stipulated by the offeror. So maybe it's the date by which the response is due, or where the offeree should sign, that sort of thing. Third, I encourage you to try to distill as concisely as you can key lessons from main cases, problems, and class hypotheticals. And here, you don't have to cover every single variation. You want to identify what you think are the really key things that might be useful as you're looking to analyze a set of facts. So in the Roth case, which is the one where the offeree signed in the wrong place, you might note that a key lesson there is where the offeror has been specific about how to accept. A court will strictly enforce this requirement even if the apparent intention of the offeree was to accept. Now, quick point here. I'm not looking necessarily for you to cite cases by name in your exam. You can do so if that's a useful shorthand, so that you don't need to elaborate much. But I'm also perfectly fine with you saying, in the case where the offeree signed at the wrong place, we saw that where the offeror has been specific about how to accept, a court will strictly enforce this requirement. And then in your exam, you might proceed to say, in contrast, in this situation, the offeror was not so specific, or the form was more ambiguous. And you can proceed to distinguish the facts that are presented to you from the facts that are laid out in the Roth case. Again, the point here on your detailed outline is to give you just enough so that you can remember the cases Remember the key lesson without getting embroiled in all of the details. I also think it's a good idea as you're working through your detailed outline, which is something that you can try to do at the end of each week, to note where we've had some big policy discussions. So Roth versus Malson led into a big discussion about whether we like formalism, whether this is a good example of formalism at its best or a good example of everything that's wrong with formalism, which our class happily had very different views about. More on that point on our next slide. So another reference point for this section of the course was the famous lost cat hypothetical. So where the offeror has specified performance as the means of acceptance and not a return promise, then the offeree may accept only through performance. That was one of the lessons that we took from that lost cat hypothetical. And you might also note that that lost cat hypothetical was an illustration of a reward situation, and that this general rule that or lesson that I've identified here is typically going to arise in reward situations or bonus situations where the offeree's return promise wouldn't be very credible. It doesn't make much sense for the offeree to promise to find the cat. Who knows if he or she would be able to do so. Okay, so again, your detailed outline should be detailed, should capture everything that is going to be critical for you to answer, to analyze a particular step during an exam, but should not go beyond that. You've got your notes. You want to translate your notes and the other materials into this. Okay, the last tool that I suggest is a tool that you can use to make a list of and identify kind of key questions around the policy and theory issues that we encounter over the course of the term. So a good example of this is something that we've been talking about a fair bit lately, which is whether formalism is a good thing in contracts law. And so here, and this will be especially familiar to you after we finish our discussion of consideration, you'll want to start off by just noting, okay, formalism, that's one issue, and then begin sort of laying out what the issues are as they come up. Now, early in the term, we were just talking about benefits and liabilities. We've got some benefits listed here. Okay, it creates clarity and predictability in judicial economy. And we've got some liabilities. Oh gosh, it encourages parties to be opportunistic or encourages unfair behavior. Maybe inconsistent with the way things are usually done in a particular business, with the customs in that trade. Maybe inconsistent with the subjective intent of the parties. We saw that in Roth versus Malson. And indeed, you may even put in parentheses. A great example here is that case where the party signed in the wrong place. I encourage you also to think about listing examples of the kind of formalities that we encounter, like a writing or a signature, and maybe even as well a signature being in a particular space, using particular words, which will become more relevant to us in the later part of the course. Consideration is another example of formalities. And then I'm saying this last, even though you might address it first in an essay. You might think about the functions of formalities, which we just talked about in our last class. Evidentiary, cautionary, and channeling functions. Make sure that you explain to yourself what those things mean, if that's useful to you. Now, just a word about why you want to do all of this. On the final exam, there will be 2 essay questions. One will be a fact pattern of the kind that we'll be doing on the midterm 2, a complex fact pattern. You'll have more time to work on it. And the second will be a theory or policy question. And the way that the form that is taken in the past, we'll probably take again this year, is I'll give you a quote to respond to. The quote might say something like, formalism in contracts law is nothing but a means of distorting the intent of parties in ways that promote the worst behavior by parties to an agreement. I don't know, something like that. And you'll be asked to respond. And so this gives you an opportunity to demonstrate that you've been thinking about the broader implications of the arguments that we have over the course of the term. And what you will be expected to do is to write an essay that offers up a clear thesis, that takes a position for or against the quote, or maybe for in part and against in part, that lays out kind of a framework for analyzing it. Okay, we know that there are certain functions that formalities serve, and that then proceeds to work through the benefits and liabilities and reach a conclusion. So that's the reason why you're undertaking to create a running list over the course of the semester of theory and policy issues, so that at the end of the term, it'll be easy for you then to look at that running list and very easily think about how you would construct an issue with respect to the different quotes that how you would construct an essay in responding to the different quotes that I'll supply you just before the essay, just before the final, and from which I will choose for the final. Okay, I hope that this is helpful to you, and as always, don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions. Good luck.